This is your friendly neighborhood AD/Slasher librarian back for some more story time. Today, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Protege, Chapter 6. Look who decided to grace us with his presence this fine afternoon. Jerome groaned inwardly as he walked into the room. Bad enough that he'd been assigned detention, but having to serve it with Pat Cottrell was infinitely worse. At least Cottrell's buddies weren't among the half-dozen other kids, mostly males, in the room. Grab a seat, sit down, and be quiet. Make any trouble, and you'll be back here again tomorrow. The man sitting at the desk, whose face was hidden by the copy of USA Today he was reading, was Mr. Nilsson, one of the math teachers. Despite his temper, Jerome hadn't been in detention since junior high, and he'd never had Mr. Nilsson as a teacher, but he knew the man by reputation. All the kids in Springwood High did. Among with teaching, Nilsson was also a wrestling coach, and had an appropriately belligerent attitude to go along with the job. The same attitude also made him a natural to oversee the malefactors sentenced to afternoon detention. Jerome decided it was best to keep his mouth shut and do what the man said. Since there were plenty of open seats, he took one in the front near the door as far away from Cottrell, who sat in the back, as possible. "What did you do to get tossed in here with the rest of us criminals, Starkey?" Cottrell asked. Jerome ignored him and sat down. Mr. Nilsson lowered his paper and glared at Cottrell. "What part of shut up don't you understand, Cottrell?" Cottrell scowled, but he didn't respond. Mr. Nilsson scowled right back, and he was far more skilled at it. A moment later, Cottrell broke eye contact and looked out the window. Smirking over his victory, Nilsson raised his paper and returned to reading. Cottrell had hated Jerome for years, ever since they'd been 5. They'd both been in the same kindergarten class, and even then the basic makeup of their individual personalities was in place. Jerome tended to be quiet and keep to himself, not because he was shy, but because he didn't want to risk getting angry at anyone. And Cottrell, even then he was an asshole, just a much smaller one. They were out on the playground one January day. It had snowed several inches the night before, but, as was normal for Ohio, the weather had suddenly shifted to the low 40s. The snow was already starting to melt, but there was enough left to play in during recess, which was all the kids cared about. Cottrell was throwing snowballs at several other kids, mostly girls. He was alone. Eddie Jackson was in another class, and Brent Haney wouldn't move to Springwood for a couple more years at that point. Jerome, as usual, was minding his own business, rolling a snowball around to increase its size so that it might make a suitable foundation for a snowman, when something cold and wet smacked him on the back of his neck. The snowball splattered apart on impact, and some of it slid down beneath Jerome's shirt. A finger of ice traced the length of his spine, though the sensation of cold did nothing to keep Jerome cool. Temper flaring like a sudden wildfire, he whirled around to see who had thrown the snowball at him. He wasn't surprised to see Cottrell standing several yards away, pointing at him and laughing. Jerome had only a handful of years so far to learn how to control his temper. So though he knew he shouldn't, that it would only get him in trouble with his dad when he got home, his dad, who had just legally adopted Jerome, changing the boy's last name from Larkin to Starkey, he started walking toward Pat Cottrell. Pat didn't have any cronies to gloat to yet, but enough of the other children on the playground had turned to witness what was happening to give him a fairly good-sized audience. "What's the matter, kid? Some snow go down your pants?" These were kindergartners. Anything to do with bathrooms, butts, or a combination of the two was considered the height of hilarity. A number of bystanders giggled at Cottrell's display of wit. Encouraged by his audience response, Cottrell continued, "I bet your butt's turning blue, or maybe your pee-pee is." More laughter, mixed with a few gasps from children who'd never imagined they'd ever hear anyone say that sort of thing out loud, let alone on school grounds. Jerome didn't respond, didn't react. He just kept walking toward Cottrell. Pat was starting to get nervous. His eyes shifted back and forth from Jerome to his audience, and if no one had been watching, perhaps Cottrell would have turned and run from Jerome. But they were watching, especially the girls, and Cottrell held his ground. "I'm going to call you Snowball Butt from now on. What do you think about that?" Jerome had closed to within a few feet of Cottrell, and he started running. Cottrell squealed as Jerome jumped on him and began pounding the shit out of him with his tiny 5-year-old fists. Jerome might not have possessed the muscle to do much damage yet, but what he lacked in strength he more than made up in fury. Blow after blow rained down on Catrill, striking him on the head, on the shoulders, the chest, the face. He had sobbed. Tears gushed from the corners of his eyes, and snot had run from his nostrils like they were twin faucets. He begged Jerome to stop, threatened to tell a teacher, called out for his mommy, as if she might somehow psychically detect her son was in trouble and come rushing to his aid. To be fair, Catrill did attempt to block Jerome's blows, though mostly all he managed to do was get hit on the arm instead of the inner body. Catrill started flailing his arms wildly then, and by sheer luck he managed to connect a fist with Jerome's chin. As frightened as Catrill was, the blow had almost no power to it, but Jerome's tongue had been protruding from the corner of his mouth while he beat on Catrill, and thanks to the love tap on the chin, his teeth clacked together, biting into his tongue. Blood spewed from the cut running out of his mouth, dribbling over his lips and down his chin to splatter onto Catrill's coat. The injury hurt, but Jerome really didn't care about that. What he cared about was the look of smug triumph that Catrill gave him. I got you and made you bleed. You a-hole. The kids whose ears were sensitive to such language gasped again, while everyone else just laughed, as blood continued to drip from Jerome's mouth and onto Catrill's coat. Pat started laughing and repeated in a sing-song voice, I got you, oh yes, I got you. Jerome's pain dwindled to an infinitesimal spark as his anger surged to new heights. He let out a cry of rage that held only the most rudimentary relationship to a human voice. And then he knelt down, sank his teeth into the skin above Catrill's left eyebrow, and bit down hard. As white-hot agony blazed across Catrill's nerve endings, he shrieked like a wounded animal and struggled to pull free of his attacker. But Jerome refused to let go, and he was still holding the skin from Catrill's forehead between his teeth when adult hands suddenly had a hold of him, and adult voices, some gentle, some stern, all alarmed, urged him to open his mouth and let Catrill go. It took 5 minutes for the teachers, who'd been summoned by Catrill's screams, to get Jerome calmed down enough to let go of Pat's flesh without tearing any off. Catrill, wailing as if he thought he was going to die any second, was whisked off to the school's nurse's office, while Jerome was hauled off to the principal's, there to await the arrival of his father, whom the principal had called at work. 17-year-old Jerome believed that one of the reasons Catrill hated him, not that someone like him needed an excuse to hate, was because of the scar on his forehead that no amount of stitches or surgery had been able to entirely remove. But much more than that, Jerome had humiliated him in front of the other kids, especially the girls. This was an absolutely unforgivable crime as far as Catrill was concerned, and so they'd been enemies ever since. And while Jerome was usually able to avoid Catrill most of the time, Catrill made it a habit, no, more like his holy mission, to irritate Jerome as much as possible, like this morning, and like right now in detention. Jerome was glad to see Mr. Nilsson put Catrill in his place. It was the first positive thing that had happened to him since biology class, not counting lunch with Cheryl and Elle, that is, though neither of them had been able to do much to cheer him up, regardless of how hard they tried. He hadn't told them the truth about what had happened, not the whole truth anyway. How could you explain to your girlfriend and your best friend that you'd had a hallucination and murdered what you thought had been a talking, intestine-throwing frog? Since neither of them were in the class, he'd told them he'd got into an argument with his lab partner. Not that he had one. Gotten pissed off, lost his temper, and sliced up the frog. Given his difficulty managing anger, both Cheryl and Elle had no trouble accepting his story. Only they were more worried about him than ever before. Cheryl had gone so far as to suggest he might consider going to see a counselor or something. But just because a guy got mad from time to time didn't mean he was crazy, right? What about a guy who thinks dead frogs can talk? A voice in his mind whispered. Jerome decided to ignore that thought and get busy on some homework. He unzipped his backpack, took out his world history book, opened it and started reading about the construction of the Great Wall of China. It was interesting enough, but it wasn't long before his mind started to wander. He didn't have to worry about Dad or Lynn finding out about his detention. The school didn't send a note home when you were in high school, and he was scheduled to work at the video store this afternoon, so it wouldn't seem all that strange that he didn't come home immediately after school. He often hung out with Elle or Crystal before going to work, too. Speaking of his friends, Elle had gone to the store to smooth things over with his parents, so Jerome wouldn't get in trouble for coming in late. And even though Jerome had told Cheryl to go on home so she wouldn't waste her time, she'd insisted on waiting for him outside the school. "It's only 45 minutes," she'd said. "Plus, it's a nice day outside. I'll sit under a tree and do some homework." Despite urging her to go home, Jerome had been pleased that she'd chosen to wait, until it had occurred to him that perhaps she was waiting not so much out of a desire to be with him, but because she was worried about him, afraid his temper would flare up and get him into even more trouble. Not for the first time he wondered if Cheryl would be better off without him. Despite his best efforts to control his temper, it was becoming increasingly difficult as time went by. He hated the way his temper worried Cheryl. He'd never been angry with her before, nor with Elle either, but just being around him and watching him struggle to control his anger seemed to bring her so much pain. And the last thing in the world that he wanted to do was hurt her, even unintentionally. "If you really loved her, Starkey, you'd break up with her." Jerome whirled around to face a grinning Catrill. "What did you say? You care for Cheryl, right? Maybe even love her, or at least think that you do. Then the best thing you can do for her is to break up with her and stay out of her life before you ruin it completely. If you really do love her, that is. Well, I don't know, maybe you don't." Jerome couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had no trouble believing that Catrill would say these things, but to say them here, now, with Mr. Nilsson present? Jerome turned to glance at the teacher. Nilsson still sat at his desk, paper held up in front of his face. He didn't say anything. Didn't so much as move. It seemed as if he hadn't heard what Catrill had said, but that didn't seem possible. Even if Nilsson were somehow so caught up in reading that he hadn't heard every word, Catrill had spoken in the normal tone of voice. He hadn't whispered, and Nilsson had to at least be aware that Catrill had spoken. Jerome glanced at his fellow inmates, but none of the other kids sentenced to detention gave any indication that they had heard Catrill either. They stared off into space, glanced out the window, sat with their heads down on their desktops, napping. "But then again, maybe Cheryl's already wised up, eh, Starkey?" Catrill stood and pulled his slipknot t-shirt over his head. His chest was hairless, lean, ribs standing out as if he were a famine victim instead of a middle-class Ohio teenager. But what grabbed and held Jerome's attention was a large tattoo that covered Catrill's chest. It was a detailed rendering of Cheryl and Catrill himself, and they were kissing. Jerome could only stare in stunned amazement at the tattoo, while Catrill stood bare-chested, grinning at him. As Jerome watched, the tattoo images of Cheryl and Catrill began to move, as if Catrill's chest were a flesh screen playing a realistic cartoon. They continued kissing, making out with increasing passion and fervor. Lips, tongues, hands roamed over one another, and clothes began to come off. Soon both Cheryl and Catrill were naked and doing more than just kissing, a lot more. And Jerome thought he could actually hear the two of them, heavy, lust-filled breaths, tremulous sighs, pleasure-induced moans. Catrill's grin widened further. "Does she make these kind of sounds when she's with you, Starkey?" "Bet she doesn't." Jerome knew something was wrong here. There was no way this could be real. He'd never seen a tattoo or near photographic quality like this before, let alone one that actually moved. But despite this knowledge, he couldn't stop his anger from rising. His anger didn't care whether the image on Catrill's chest was real or not. Didn't care how mere ink injected beneath the skin could possibly be alive and animated. All it cared about was making the image stop and making Catrill pay for showing it to him. Jerome bolted out of his chair and ran toward Catrill, shoving empty desks and chairs out of his way as he went. The other students in detention were snapped out of whatever daze they'd been in, and some stared at Jerome. Some laughed, and some scrambled to get the hell out of his way. Dimly, Jerome was aware of someone shouting his name, an adult, he thought, though he wasn't certain. But whoever it was and whatever they wanted would just have to wait until he dealt with Catrill. As Jerome drew near his grinning nemesis, he suddenly became aware of two Catrills, two distinct and different images, as if Jerome were seeing a different one with each eye and his brain was having trouble reconciling the separate pictures. In one image, Catrill was bare-chested and grinning as his tattoo avatar convorted with Jerome's girlfriend. But in the second image, Catrill was still sitting at his desk, shirt on, and looking at Jerome with wide, confused eyes that held more than a hint of fear. Just as Jerome reached Catrill, the rational part of his mind, which was reduced to a small, quiet voice compared to the furious roaring of his anger, suggested that Jerome wait to sort out the separate images before he did anything rash. But it was too late. Jerome's hand shot out and grabbed Catrill's neck. Catrill's throat made a wet clicking sound as Jerome tightened his grip and began to squeeze. Catrill grabbed Jerome's wrist and tried to tear his hands from his neck. But Jerome's strength was fueled by his rage, and Catrill couldn't so much as budge his hands. Catrill's face began to darken, and his eyes bulged out like those of a frog, a dead frog pinned down and ready for dissection. Catrill kicked and thrashed, trying to dislodge Jerome's grip, but without success. Jerome continued to squeeze harder. He felt other hands on him, pulling at his shoulders, tugging at his arms, but he ignored the sensations. Catrill deserved nothing less than death for profaning Cheryl's image like that, and that's exactly what Jerome intended to give him. He squeezed even harder, until Catrill's already red face began to edge toward purple. Catrill was clawing at Jerome's hands now, nails digging into the flesh of Jerome's fingers, ripping out tiny chunks of skin and causing blood to well forth. Jerome was distantly aware of the blood and the pain that came along with it, but he ignored it. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered, except Catrill's death. He heard shouting, felt the hands gripping him begin to pull him backward. There were too many hands for Jerome to resist, and he felt his fingers begin to slip away from Catrill's throat. Jerome let out a cry of rage and frustration as his grip was finally broken and Catrill gasped for air. He saw Catrill's image, the seated Catrill, the one still wearing his shirt, recede as he was pulled backward, and he tried to break free of whoever had hold of him, but there were too many, and they were too strong. "I don't know. What the hell's wrong with you, boy?" the adult voice said between gulps of air. "But you better calm the fuck down right now." Jerome, still clawing the air as if he might get a hold of Catrill's throat once more, recognized the voice as belonging to an adult male, but he couldn't quite place it. Was it his dad? No, the voice was too low, the tone too harsh. And then he remembered, Nilsson, detention, and just like that his anger had subsided. It didn't drain away completely, didn't fade. One second it was there, blazing as fiercely as ever, and the next it was just gone, as if it had never existed. He stopped struggling, and Nilsson and the others, who he realized were other young men sentenced to detention like himself, were able to pull him out of the room and into the hallway. Just before he was pulled through the door and into the hall, he looked back at Catrill, saw the jackass sitting at his desk and rubbing his throat with his bare hands. When Catrill saw Jerome looking at him, he mouthed the words, "You're dead," before Jerome was pulled all the way out of the room and Catrill was lost to sight. Chapter 7. Explain yourself. The words were delivered with just the right mix of authority and concern, intended to show Jerome that while Assistant Principal LeClaire didn't intend to put up with any nonsense, she still cared about Jerome as a person. Jerome knew she was just doing her job and that she didn't care about him in the slightest. Still, he found himself responding to her tone nevertheless. Pat, came up to me and a couple of my friends before first bell this morning. He said some things, tossed a couple insults around, then left. He made me mad, but I figured he wasn't worth getting into trouble over, so I left him alone. Miss LeClaire's office was small, but there was more than enough room for the two of them. Him in front of the desk, her behind it. The surface of her desk was bare. He thought of a bumper sticker he'd seen once. A clean desk is a sign of a sick mind. With the exception of her PC, phone, and a single manila folder full of papers, and he knew that he was looking at an almost mythic document, his permanent record. There were framed diplomas on the walls, bachelor's and master's degrees, but otherwise the office had little in the way of decorative touches. A potted fern sitting atop a gray filing cabinet, a wall calendar with images of Japanese woodblock art, and a plaque mounted on the wall that, "With many thanks for 10 years of exemplary service to the Springwood School District." Jerome had never seen that plaque before, and he'd had no idea that Miss LeClaire had been at the high school for that long. She looked too young to have worked anywhere for 10 years. She was an attractive woman with long, perfectly styled brown hair, gold bracelets on her wrist, and gold earrings in both ears. She wore a long-sleeved white blouse and a light grayish skirt that came to the top of her knees. Black, open-toed shoes completed her ensemble, allowing Jerome to see that, while she wore no nail polish on her fingers, her toenails were painted cherry red. Every guy in school lusted after her, especially with that authoritative dominatrix thing she had going. But she had a reputation as a hard-ass, and few of them wanted to end up where Jerome was. Miss LeClaire's eyes skimmed him skeptically. "So, you decided to wait and get revenge in detention?" "I didn't decide anything," Jerome said, doing his best to keep the frustration he felt out of his voice and not quite succeeding. It just kind of happened, ma'am. Miss LeClaire regarded him silently for several moments, as if trying to determine whether he was mocking her. Finally, she said, "Tell me, Jerome, how can someone choking another human being just kind of happen?" Jerome started to explain, but then he stopped himself. What would Miss LeClaire think if he told her about the vision of Catrill with an animated tattoo, or about his hallucination of the talking frog in biology class? She'd think he was going crazy. Hell, he thought he was going crazy. So he kept his mouth shut and stared down at the floor. "If you don't have an explanation for your attack on Pat Catrill, maybe you can tell me about biology class today. Mr. Hauser said you mutilated the frog you were supposed to be dissecting. Just cut it to pieces. And quite violently, I might add." Jerome said the first thing that came to his mind. "It was a joke, you know." "A joke," she repeated, as if it were the lamest explanation she'd ever heard during her 10 years of exemplary service at Springwood High. Jerome shrugged, the teenager's all-purpose response to an adult question. "I admit it was stupid. I apologized to Mr. Hauser, and he let me work on another frog." "I might be more inclined to accept your story, Jerome, if you hadn't demonstrated violent behavior toward Pat Catrill later in the day. From what Mr. Nielsen said, you might well have killed the boy if he and some of the other students in detention hadn't managed to pull you off of him. Mr. Nielsen was so disturbed by your violent actions that he was in favor of me calling the police. In fact, he didn't want me to meet with you alone." Jerome couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You're making me sound like I'm some sort of criminal." "I don't think that, Jerome. Obviously, or I would have followed Mr. Nielsen's advice." She looked down at the folder on her desk, opened it, and began shuffling through the papers it held. "I had a chance to glance over your file while you were waiting to see me. You've had a number of anger-related incidents over the years, including, I noted, one with Pat Catrill in kindergarten." She closed the folder and looked up at him once more. "To be honest, Jerome, one of the first things we suspect in an incident such as your attack on Pat Catrill today is drug use, especially since you demonstrated erratic behavior earlier in Mr. Hauser's class." "I don't do drugs," Jerome said, and it was true. He had enough problems controlling his anger without using chemicals that might make it even harder for him to keep his emotions in check. "Call the school nurse. She can test me right now if you want." "Thank you, but that won't be necessary." Miss LeClaire paused as if trying to determine the best way to proceed. "From time to time, Jerome, certain disturbances occur here in Springwood. Outbreaks of violence that often involve young people and their, dreams." She leaned forward, suddenly intense. "Tell me, Jerome, have you been having any unusual dreams lately?" "Give Mommy a kiss goodbye," he thought. "Not really. I don't remember my dreams much." Miss LeClaire looked at him a moment longer before finally nodding and sitting back in her chair. For some reason she seemed strangely relieved. "In that case, from the pattern I saw in your file, I suspect that you might have a problem of a different sort. There are certain conditions, sometimes physiological, sometimes biochemical, often a combination, in which a person experiences sudden, unexplained flare-ups of anger and violent behavior. I believe there's a chance you may be suffering from one of these conditions, Jerome. Have you ever spoken to anyone, your parents, a doctor, a clergyman, about your anger?" Jerome's instinct was to tell Miss LeClaire that she was off base, that he didn't have any problem with anger. He'd spent his whole life trying to hide his anger, along with the shame it caused, from adults. But he took a deep breath and let it out in a long sigh. Maybe it was time that he stopped fighting, or at least stopped fighting alone. "Just my friends," Jerome said in a quiet voice. "I should suspend you for your attack on Pat Catrill," Miss LeClaire said. "But if you're willing to go talk to a doctor at Weston Hills about these angry feelings you experience, I won't. To be honest, I'm more interested in getting you the help that you need, instead of punishing you. What do you think?" Though he wasn't sure why, Jerome shuddered at Miss LeClaire's mention of Weston Hills Psychiatric Hospital. It was a mental health and drug rehabilitation center on the outskirts of town, no different than hundreds of others throughout the country. Sure, there were stories about it, rumors that it hadn't always been a modern hospital. Supposedly, at one point in the past, it had been closer to a medieval asylum for the insane, a place where the most dangerous madmen were locked away. and even then, atrocities too horrible to talk about were committed behind its walls. Every town has a bad place, somewhere that is reputed to be intrinsically evil, where awful events once occurred and the spirits of the vengeful dead are purported to linger. But Jerome knew all that stuff was a crock of shit. Sure, bad things did happen sometimes, but that was life. The junk about evil spirits made up out of ignorance and sheer small-town boredom. Weston Hills was a hospital, and that's all it was. Nothing whatsoever to be afraid of. Besides, Miss LeClaire's offer might well be the opportunity he'd been hoping for. A chance for him finally to get a handle on his emotions and start living a normal life. "Okay," he said. Miss LeClaire smiled. "Good. I'll have to talk to your parents about it and get their permission, though." "I understand." Jerome was surprised at the feeling of relief that washed over him. It was as if a tension that he'd carried for so long that he wasn't even aware of it was finally beginning to drain away. "All right, then. I'll call tonight after—" But Miss LeClaire's phone rang before she could finish her sentence. "Excuse me." She picked up the receiver. "Yes?" "Well, can't it wait?" "Patty? I'm talking with a student and—" She sighed. "Very well, I'll be right out." She hung up the phone and looked at Jerome. "It seems the office secretary is having problems with her email program and needs my help. It'll only take a moment, so if you don't mind waiting—" "Go ahead." "Thank you. I won't be more than a minute or two, and then we can finish up our discussion, and you can be on your way." She gave him a smile, one so genuine that it made him believe he'd been wrong about her. She was just doing her job. She really did care. Then she came out from behind her desk, walked past him and out of the office, closing the door behind her. Alone for the moment, Jerome slumped back in his chair, as a sensation of weariness came over him. He'd been through a lot today, and he felt emotionally drained. When he got out of here, he'd have to see if he could go home and sneak in a nap before having to go into work at the video store. He hoped Elle's parents would understand, especially once he told them the reason he was late, and that he was finally going to get some help. He sighed and closed his eyes, intending only to rest them for a moment until Miss LeClaire returned. But they'd only been closed a few seconds when the office door burst open. Jerome turned toward the sudden noise and saw a pair of burly men in white uniforms heading toward him. Before he could rise from his chair, they each took a hold of one of his arms with the vice-like grips and held him down. "What the hell are you doing? Let me go!" Jerome struggled, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't break free from his two captors. "You might as well not fight it, Jerome," the one holding on to his right arm said. "It'll be a lot easier on you if you just relax," the man's partner said, but then quickly added, "Not!" There was something oddly familiar about the voice. He looked at the men, first one, then the other. When they'd come at him, they'd had normal, if nondescript, faces. But now both looked exactly the same. Bald, flame-scarred skin, grinning yellow teeth, and wide, bloodshot eyes that danced with equal measures of madness and malice. Each of the hideous men had a name tag on his uniform, and both read the same: Weston Hills Psychiatric Hospital, F. Krueger. It was the man from his dream last night. Freddy times 2. "You're not real," Jerome said. "Neither of you." "I just fell back asleep while waiting for Miss LeClaire to get back, that's all. She'll come into the office, her real office, any minute now, and I'll wake up and you'll be gone." Both of the Freddys cackled. "You wish," said the one on the right. "For you it doesn't matter," the second one said, "asleep or awake." "We're always there," they finished together. At the moment, Miss LeClaire came walking back into her office exactly as Jerome had predicted. "Ah, good, I see you have the situation well in hand." "He's putting up a fight," Freddy 1 said. "But it's nothing we can't handle, ma'am," Freddy 2 added. Good, good. But I think the procedure will go more smoothly if we restrain him a bit more securely, don't you?" Miss LeClaire gestured, and Jerome hissed in pain. He looked down to see that his arms, from wrist to elbow, were now bound to the chair with loops of silvery razor wire. The wire cut into his flesh, and thick drops of blood began to patter to the floor. Now that the razor wire was in place, the two Freddys let go of him, though they remained standing right next to his chair. "I wouldn't struggle too much," Miss LeClaire said. "You don't want to slice your hands off, and we certainly don't want them damaged. We have plans for those hands of yours, Jerome, and we'd hate to see them go to waste, she smiled. As much fun as that might be. Miss LeClaire raised her left hand, and Jerome saw she was wearing a brown glove with metal claws attached. She slashed her face with the finger knives, her skin parted like tissue paper, and her features fell away to reveal yet another grinning Freddy beneath. The pieces of Miss LeClaire's discarded face, hair included, evaporated like mist when they hit the floor.
"I'd say surprise," Freddy 3 said, "but I bet you aren't, are you?"
The other two Freddys chuckled at this. Freddy 3 still wore Miss LeClaire's blouse and skirt, but instead of making him look ridiculous, the outfit somehow made him seem even more sinister than before. He stepped up to Jerome and touched the tip of the blade attached to his index finger to the soft underside of Jerome's jaw. The moment the metal came in contact with Jerome's skin, he drew in a hissing breath of air. The metal was damn cold, and the frigid temperature penetrated Jerome's bones and radiated cold throughout his body. Freddy leaned closer, allowing Jerome to get a good whiff of the foul odor wafting from his open mouth. Inhaling Freddy's breath was like dunking your nose in raw sewage, in which large chunks of rotting animal flesh had been marinating for several weeks. His nasal passages and throat felt suddenly thick and coated with the stench of Freddy's rancid breath.
"Got a newsflash for you, Jerome. You've been a pet project of mine for the last 17 years. I haven't been able to keep up with you the way I would have liked during that time, thanks to the dream catcher your bitch of an aunt gave you. But now that you and I have been reunited, you can bet I'm going to make up for lost time, son."
Freddy pulled his finger blade away from Jerome's chin, turned it downward, then hooked the tip over the collar of his shirt until it touched the first button. He put a bit of pressure on it, and the button popped off. Freddy repeated this procedure until every button had been sliced away, and Jerome's shirt hung open to reveal his scrawny white chest beneath. When that was done, Freddy nodded to his other two selves, and they each put a hand on Jerome's shoulders to steady him.
"Tell me something, Jerome. Ever hear of a little guy named Pinocchio?"
Despite the pain of the wounds and his growing fear, Jerome answered, "I saw the cartoon when I was a kid." Freddy leaned forward and practically shouted his reply.
"I don't mean the cutesy-wootsy Disney version. I'm talking about the real deal. The actual story that started it all."
Jerome shook his head.
"Then permit me to smarten you up, kid. The story begins and goes along pretty much the same as all the wimp-ass version you're used to. Without all the sickly sweet songs, of course. A lonely woodcarver makes a marionette and wishes it could be a living boy to keep him company. The puppet, which he of course names Pinocchio, comes to life and decides to go off and seek his fortune. A cricket warns old woodenhead against going, tells him that he'll be breaking Geppetto's heart if he leaves. Pinocchio considers the cricket's advice for a moment before crushing the obnoxious little bug beneath one of his wooden feet and heading off into the big wide world to have himself a little fun."
"That's awful," Jerome said. Freddy 3 shrugged.
"That's fairy tales for you. They can be awfully grim sometimes. Your situation is similar, Jerome. I'm Geppetto, and you're my puppet. But before I can pull your strings, I need to squash a nasty little thing you've picked up over the years that I was forced to neglect you."
"What's that?" Jerome said. Freddy grinned.
"A conscience."
He jammed his knife glove into Jerome's bare abdomen, and the boy screamed as he felt the icy blades pierce skin and muscle before sinking deep into his soft parts. Jerome tried to pull away from the blades buried in his gut, but the razor wire around his forearms held him fast to the chair, as did the other two Freddys standing behind him. Jerome continued to scream as Freddy explored his insides, stirring his knives around as if he were looking for something. The pain was intolerable, and just as Jerome thought he was going to pass out, Freddy shouted,
"Gotcha!"
and yanked his finger claws out of Jerome's gut in a spray of blood and chunks of shredded intestine. Jerome felt something slipping out of him, heard something soft and wet hit the floor with a moist smack, and he realized with horror that he'd been disemboweled. Freddy held up his claw glove, and through blurry, tear-stained eyes, Jerome saw that a tiny squirming insect was speared on the tip of the index finger claw. It was a cricket. With a flick of his claw, Freddy popped the cricket into his mouth and crunched it between his crooked yellow teeth.
"Not bad,"
Freddy said as he chewed thoughtfully.
"Could use a little salt, though."
Freddy laughed then, his voice a cross between fingernails raking a chalkboard and bones caught in a meat grinder. The sound cut through Jerome more effectively than Freddy's claws ever could, and it cut far deeper, too. Deeper than meat and organs, deeper than bone and marrow, it cut into Jerome's very soul. Fury beyond anything he'd ever known erupted in Jerome, wild, crazed power, as if every cell in his being was suddenly aflame. Gone were the pain of his injuries, the horror of being mutilated, the fear that he was going to die. All that remained was Freddy, that damn laughter of his, and the overwhelming need to snuff it out once and for all. Jerome yanked at the razor wire restraints that bound him to the chair. The razors stripped the outer flesh from his arms as Jerome pulled them free. Both arms were raw, bloody messes from the elbow down, but Jerome did not care. All he cared about was getting his blood-slick hands on Freddy. The other two Freddys, the ones dressed as hospital orderlies, tried to stop him, but he shrugged them off with ease, as if they possessed no more strength than a pair of sickly toddlers. Jerome ran behind Miss LeClaire's desk, opened the middle drawer, and found what he was looking for: scissors. He wrapped his fingers around the handle, and when one of the white-coat Freddys came at him, he stabbed the son of a bitch in the throat. Blood sprayed from the wound as if the fluid in the orderly's circulatory system was under high pressure, and his coat wasn't so white anymore. As the first orderly slumped to the office floor, the second came at Jerome with the same results. As the two Freddy doppelgangers lay bleeding to death on the floor, Jerome turned to the last Freddy. Scissors gripped tight, blood dripping from their tips. Far from being upset at seeing his two other selves taken out by a scissor-wielding punk, the remaining Freddy seemed to find it hilarious. He roared with laughter, his mouth seeming to stretch wider, far wider than a human mouth could. And still it stretched further, until Jerome could no longer see those bloodshot eyes full of madness and bloodlust, could no longer see the scarred and cracked skin, the witch-hooked nose, the crooked yellow teeth, until all that remained was the darkness that swirled inside the impossibly huge mouth. That and the mocking laughter echoing throughout all existence. Jerome threw himself toward the darkness, knowing that Freddy was in there somewhere. All he had to do was slash out with his scissors. "Jerome? Honey?" He knew that voice, knew it as well as he did his own, if not better. He experienced a dizzying moment of vertigo, as if the entire world tilted to the side for a moment before slowly righting itself. He blinked. The darkness was gone, and he was looking into Cheryl's face. The pain of his wounds had vanished as well, and when he glanced down at his hands, he saw that they were whole and unmarked, save for where Cantrell had scratched him earlier. And one of those hands, his left, strangely enough, as he was right-handed, was still holding the scissors. "What are you doing here?" He asked the question, coming out harsher than he intended it, if he hadn't come out of his dream or hallucination or whatever it had been in time. Cheryl eyed the scissors in his hand and frowned, but she answered his question. "Detention was over, but you didn't come out with the other kids. So I came inside and checked the office. Miss LeClaire's out there helping the secretary with her computer, and she told me you were in here and that it was okay if I came in to see you." Jerome had the sense that Cheryl wasn't telling him the whole story. Most likely Cantrell had told her what had happened after he was released from detention, but Cheryl didn't want to risk upsetting him further by mentioning Cantrell's name. Cheryl nodded towards the scissors still clutched in his left hand. "What are you doing with those?" "Nothing, just messing around." He placed the scissors down on Miss LeClaire's desk, then turned back to Cheryl. Before she could challenge his lame excuse, he said, "I'm so glad it was you that came in." Cheryl's frown deepened. Why? He couldn't tell her the real reason, that he was terrified of what he might have done if Miss LeClaire had been the one to walk through the doorway while he was in the grip of the delusion. He forced a smile. "Because I'm always glad to see you." Cheryl looked at him skeptically for a moment before smiling and reaching out to take his hand. "Charmer," she said. Yeah, that's me, Jerome thought as he remembered how he'd stabbed the two white-coated Freddys in the throat, and how he'd intended to do the same to the third one. I'm a real sweetheart. Okay, this has been chapters 6 and 7 of A Nightmare on Elm Street Protege. I was only going to put out chapters 4 and 5 today, but I'm really digging this story. And since I'm doing Freddy one day, Jason the next, I thought I'd go ahead and throw out a bonus video today so y'all had 4 chapters instead of 2. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm enjoying the story myself. Can't wait to see how it turns out. Please hit that like button. Drop me a comment. If you haven't already, then go ahead and subscribe. Spread the word out there. Click the bell so you always know when new chapters are coming. You never know when I'm going to drop bonus chapters like I did today, so click that bell. And until next time, this has been your 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and
pleasant dreams!